February 8th, 1904. Without a declaration of war, without warning, Japanese torpedo boats slip into the harbor at Port Arthur on the coast of Manchuria and attack the Russian Pacific Fleet at anchor. Ships explode. Men die in their sleep. The Russian Naval Command, caught completely unprepared, scrambles to respond to an attack nobody had believed Japan would dare to make. The world watched what followed with the kind of disbelief reserved for events that violate everything assumed to be true. Japan, a country that had been a feudal society 40 years earlier, that had no industrial tradition, that European powers casually referred to as a second-rate Asian nation, proceeded to destroy the army of the largest country on Earth, sink an entire fleet that had sailed halfway around the world to fight it, and force Russia to the negotiating table in the most humiliating military defeat a European great power had suffered in a century. Nobody expected this. Not the Russians, who had dismissed Japan so thoroughly that their commanders hadn't bothered to prepare serious defenses. Not the Europeans, who had built an entire theory of racial and civilizational hierarchy on the assumption that Western armies were categorically superior to Asian ones. Not the Americans, who watched with fascination as their assumptions about global power crumbled battle by battle. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 didn't just change the balance of power in East Asia. It cracked the foundation of the world order that European imperialism had constructed. And the tremors ran all the way to St. Petersburg, where a humiliated czar faced a revolution he had never seen coming either. Russia's expansion eastward had been moving for centuries, a slow, relentless pressure across Siberia toward the Pacific that had reached the sea by the mid-17th century. By the late 19th century, Russian ambitions in East Asia were accelerating dramatically. The Trans-Siberian Railway, begun in 1891 and still under construction, would eventually connect Moscow to Vladivostok across nearly 6,000 miles. The largest infrastructure project in human history to that point, designed explicitly to project Russian military and commercial power into the Pacific. The problem was that East Asia was not empty. China was weakening, but still territorially vast. Korea occupied a strategically crucial peninsula between the Asian continent and the Japanese archipelago. And Japan, transformed by the Meiji Restoration of 1868 from a feudal society into a rapidly industrializing modern state, had its own ambitions in exactly the territories Russia was reaching toward. Japan's modernization was one of the most remarkable national transformations in recorded history. In 1853, American warships under Commodore Perry had appeared in Tokyo Bay and forced Japan to open its ports to foreign trade, a humiliation that Japanese leaders converted into motivation. Rather than resist Western power, they decided to master it. The Meiji government sent students to Europe and America to study everything: military organization, industrial technology, legal systems, educational methods, naval architecture. Within a generation, Japan had built a modern army on Prussian lines, a modern navy on British lines, and an industrial base capable of supplying both. The first demonstration of what this transformation had produced came in 1894 to 1895, when Japan went to war with China over Korea and won decisively, taking Formosa, the Pescadores, and, briefly, the Liaodong Peninsula with Port Arthur. The briefly matters enormously. Russia, France, and Germany intervened diplomatically, the triple intervention, forcing Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula to China on the grounds that Japanese control would threaten regional stability. Japan had no choice but to comply. 3 years later, Russia leased the Liaodong Peninsula from China and occupied Port Arthur for itself. The humiliation was not forgotten in Tokyo. Japan had won a war, been forced by European powers to surrender its gains, and then watched Russia take exactly what Japan had been compelled to return. The lesson was unambiguous. Japan needed to be strong enough that European powers couldn't simply override its interests through diplomatic pressure. The decade between the triple intervention and the outbreak of war in 1904 was spent building toward exactly that strength. Russia's position in Manchuria and Korea in the early 1900s was driven by a combination of genuine strategic interest and the particular ambitions of specific men around Tsar Nicholas II. The Trans-Siberian Railway needed a warm water terminus. Vladivostok froze in winter. Port Arthur didn't. Control of Manchuria's resources and Korean markets offered enormous commercial potential. And some influential figures at court, including the adventurer Alexander Bezobrazov, had obtained timber concessions in Korea and were pushing for aggressive forward policy to protect their investments. Nicholas II himself was not the man for this moment. Gentle, well-meaning, catastrophically unsuited for autocratic rule, he had inherited an empire and a system of government that required either genuine reform or iron competence at the top. He had neither the reformer's vision nor the autocrat's will. He surrounded himself with advisors whose primary qualification was that they told him what he wanted to hear, dismissed warnings about Japanese military capability, and assumed that any conflict with Japan would be brief and successful, a short, victorious war that would distract Russian attention from growing domestic unrest. His war minister said Japan would not fight. His viceroy in the Far East said Japan could not fight. His naval command said the Pacific Fleet was adequate for any contingency. Every assessment was wrong, and the men making them either didn't know or didn't dare say otherwise. Japan had been negotiating with Russia over Manchuria and Korea for months before February 1904, seeking some arrangement that would recognize Japan's interests in Korea in exchange for acknowledging Russian dominance in Manchuria. The negotiations went nowhere, partly because Russian officials were genuinely uncertain what they wanted, partly because the faction around Bezobrazov believed Japan would ultimately back down, and partly because the Russian diplomatic machine moved with a slowness that Japanese patience couldn't indefinitely accommodate. On February 6, 1904, Japan broke off negotiations. 2 days later, without waiting for a formal declaration of war, a tactic that would become a Japanese signature, repeated at Pearl Harbor 37 years later, torpedo boats attacked the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. The attack damaged several battleships and disrupted Russian naval operations at the critical opening of the war. It was not the knockout blow Japan had hoped for, but it established Japanese initiative from the first day. The land war began with Japanese armies crossing into Korea and moving north toward Manchuria. General Tamamoto Kuroki's First Army crossed the Yalu River in May 1904, defeating Russian forces in the first significant land engagement. The battle was militarily modest but psychologically enormous, the first time in modern history that an Asian army had defeated a European one in open field combat. European military observers, present with both armies in large numbers, noted what they saw carefully. Some updated their assessments. Many didn't. Port Arthur became the war's first great siege. The Japanese Third Army, under General Maresuke Nogi, invested the fortress with approximately 90,000 men and began the methodical, horrifically costly process of reducing its defenses. Port Arthur's garrison of roughly 40,000 Russian soldiers and sailors held out for 8 months in fighting that consumed Japanese lives at a rate that shocked even those who had expected heavy casualties. Nogi's army suffered over 57,000 casualties taking Port Arthur, losses so severe that his tactical competence was seriously questioned, and that haunted him personally until his ritual suicide on the day of Emperor Meiji's funeral in 1912. The siege tactics were a preview of what the Western Front would look like a decade later. Frontal assaults on fortified positions defended by modern rifles and artillery, resulting in casualties that industrial-age weapons could produce but pre-industrial military thinking hadn't yet absorbed. Russian defenders armed with Maxim machine guns mowed down Japanese infantry attacking across open ground. Japanese engineers tunneled toward Russian fortifications, packed the tunnels with explosives, and blew them up. Soldiers on both sides lived in trenches, died in masses, and discovered that modern firepower had made traditional offensive tactics suicidal. The major land battles in Manchuria were fought on a scale that dwarfed anything Europe had seen since Napoleonic times. At Liaoyang, in August 1904, roughly 160,000 Japanese soldiers engaged 180,000 Russians in a battle that lasted 10 days and produced over 40,000 combined casualties. The Russians fought well, their soldiers were brave, and their defensive positions strong, but their command was paralyzed by indecision. General Alexei Kuropatkin, commanding the Russian Manchurian army, had a strategic theory that required him to trade space for time, building up forces for an eventual counteroffensive. His theory may have been correct. His execution of it looked to his officers and to St. Petersburg like endless retreat. February and March 1905. The Battle of Mukden was the largest land battle in human history up to that point, numbers that would be exceeded only by the industrialized slaughter of the First World War. Approximately 330,000 Japanese soldiers engaged 340,000 Russians across a front stretching nearly 50 miles. The battle lasted 3 weeks and produced roughly 160,000 combined casualties. Japan won. Not decisively, not in the annihilating Napoleonic sense that Japanese commanders had hoped for. The Russian army retreated in reasonable order rather than collapsing, but won clearly enough that the strategic situation was unmistakable. Russia's Manchurian army had been pushed north. Port Arthur had fallen in January, and Japanese forces controlled the ground they had set out to take. What Russia could not do was bring enough force to bear quickly enough to reverse the situation, and the reason for that was the Trans-Siberian Railway. The railway that was supposed to be Russia's great strategic asset in the Far East was a single-track line across thousands of miles of Siberian wilderness. It could move approximately 3 to 4 troop trains per day in early 1904. Japan, operating with short supply lines from its home islands by sea, could concentrate and supply forces faster than Russia could reinforce across 6,000 miles of single-track railway. The infrastructure project that was supposed to project Russian power into the Pacific was projecting it far too slowly. Russia's response to the land war's failures was to send its Baltic fleet, renamed the Second Pacific Squadron, on an extraordinary voyage halfway around the world to reinforce the besieged Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur. The decision was made before Port Arthur fell. By the time the fleet arrived, Port Arthur was gone, the garrison had surrendered, and the original mission was moot. But the fleet kept coming. The voyage of the Second Pacific Squadron under Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky was a logistical nightmare and a public spectacle. 35 warships left the Baltic in October 1904 and spent 7 months sailing to their destruction. They had no friendly ports for resupply. Britain, allied with Japan, denied them access to British ports, and had to be recoaled by German merchant vessels at sea. At the Dogger Bank off the coast of England, the fleet opened fire on British fishing trawlers they had somehow mistaken for Japanese torpedo boats, killing several fishermen and nearly triggering war with Britain. The incident was humiliating and revealed the fleet's state of nerves before it had even left European waters. Rozhestvensky's ships were a mixed force of modern battleships and obsolete vessels that should never have left harbor. The crews were undertrained. The ships were overloaded with coal and supplies, and the command was burdened by an officer corps that had spent more time in ports than at sea. They sailed around Africa since the Suez Canal was unavailable, through tropical heat that fouled their anti-fouling paint and coated their hulls with marine growth that slowed their speed. By the time they reached Asian waters, the ships were in poor condition, and the crews were exhausted after 7 months at sea. Japanese Admiral Heihachiro Togo knew they were coming. He had been waiting. His fleet was fresh, well-trained, operating in home waters, and commanded by a man who had studied naval tactics with a precision that made him the finest fleet commander of his era. He chose his ground carefully, the Tsushima Strait between Korea and Japan, the most direct route the Russian fleet would take toward Vladivostok. And he waited, May 27, 1905. The Battle of Tsushima lasted 2 days and produced the most complete naval victory since Trafalgar a century earlier. It was not close. Togo's fleet intercepted the Russian squadron in the Tsushima Strait and executed a maneuver that naval historians still study, crossing the Russian T, positioning his ships perpendicular to the Russian line so that his entire broadside could fire while the Russian ships could only reply with their forward guns. The tactical geometry was perfect. The gunnery was better. Japanese shells, fitted with a new explosive called Shimos powder that generated more heat and shrapnel than Russian shells, were devastating against Russian armor and superstructure. The Russian flagship, Knyaz Suvorov, was hit repeatedly in the opening minutes, her steering destroyed, fire raging through her superstructure. Rozhestvensky was wounded. Command disintegrated. Russian ships that had survived 7 months and 20,000 miles of ocean found themselves being torn apart in a strait they had traveled less than 100 miles of. The battle turned into a rout. By the time it was over, Russia had lost 8 battleships sunk, several more captured, thousands of sailors dead, and Rozhestvensky himself captured when his torpedo boat was taken. Japan lost 3 torpedo boats, the entire Russian fleet that had sailed from the Baltic. The immense investment of money, men, and national prestige had been effectively destroyed in 2 days. Of 38 Russian vessels that entered the battle, only 3 reached Vladivostok. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Russia lost over 5,000 sailors killed and 6,000 captured. Japan lost 117 men. It was not a battle. It was an execution. Togo's signal to his fleet before the engagement has become one of the most famous in naval history, a deliberate echo of Nelson before Trafalgar. The fate of the empire rests upon this battle. Let every man do his utmost. The echo was intentional. Japan had studied the West's naval traditions as carefully as it had studied its naval technology and tactics. Togo knew exactly what reference he was making and what it meant to make it. The news reached the world and produced reactions that went far beyond the military and diplomatic. For European colonial powers managing Asian, African, and Middle Eastern populations on the assumption of inherent European superiority, Tsushima was a problem that couldn't be explained away. Japan had not won because of luck or terrain or exceptional circumstances. It had won because its navy was better trained, better led, better equipped, operating with better tactics. The racial hierarchy that underpinned European imperial ideology had no framework for this outcome. In India, nationalists discussed Tsushima openly as proof that Asian nations could master Western military methods and defeat Western powers. In Persia and the Ottoman Empire, reformers pointed to Japan as a model. In China, the lesson was absorbed and would influence the generation that eventually produced the Republican Revolution of 1911. The shock waves from a naval battle in a Korean strait reached every corner of the colonial world. The war Russia was losing in the Far East intersected with a domestic crisis that had been building for years. Nicholas II's regime was autocratic, corrupt, and genuinely unable to address the social pressures created by rapid industrialization. A growing urban working class living in appalling conditions, a peasantry still effectively bound to the land, an educated middle class with political ambitions the system refused to accommodate. On January 22, 1905, a date remembered in Russian history as Bloody Sunday, a peaceful procession of workers led by a priest named Father Georgy Gapan marched toward the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to present a petition to the Tsar. They carried icons and portraits of Nicholas, believing he would hear their grievances if they could reach him. Nicholas was not in the palace. His guards opened fire. Between 130 and 200 people were killed, hundreds more wounded. The massacre transformed the political landscape instantly. The workers who had marched, believing in the Tsar's paternal concern, discovered that the state would shoot them for asking for change. The sacred image of the Tsar as the people's father, the mystical bond between ruler and subject that Russian autocracy depended on, shattered in the snow outside the Winter Palace. What replaced it was rage. The Revolution of 1905 strikes Mutinies, peasant uprisings, political assassinations forced Nicholas into concessions he had no intention of keeping. The October Manifesto promised civil liberties and a parliament, the Duma, with genuine legislative power. It was enough to divide the opposition and allow the regime to survive. Nicholas subsequently gutted the Duma's powers as quickly as he dared, but the political compact he had tried to maintain, autocracy as the natural and sacred form of Russian government, had been permanently damaged. The battleship Potemkin mutiny became the revolution's most dramatic episode. In June 1905, the crew of the battleship Potemkin, part of the Black Sea Fleet, mutinied, threw their officers overboard, and sailed the ship under a red flag. The mutiny failed to trigger the general naval uprising its leaders hoped for, but the image of a Russian battleship flying the revolutionary flag was seared into international consciousness. Sergei Eisenstein's 1925 film would make it immortal. The connection between military defeat and revolution was not coincidental. The regime's promise had been that autocracy produced order and power. The war had produced disorder and humiliation. The soldiers dying in Manchuria, the sailors dying at Tsushima, were dying for a system that had failed to prepare them adequately, that had sent them into a war its own officials had predicted would be brief and easy, that had proved at every level incapable of the competent administration that modern warfare required. The question that hung over 1905, and that would return with far greater force in 1917, was whether Nicholas II's government deserved the loyalty it demanded. The war ended with the Treaty of Portsmouth in September 1905, negotiated with American mediation by President Theodore Roosevelt, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. Japan received the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur, the southern half of Sakhalin Island, and recognition of its dominant interests in Korea. Russia withdrew from Manchuria. The terms were less than Japan had expected after such comprehensive military success, and Japanese public opinion, which had absorbed enormous casualties and tax burdens funding the war, was furious. Riots broke out in Tokyo when the terms were announced. Japan had won the war and felt cheated at the peace. The resentment over Portsmouth would simmer for decades, feeding a nationalism that eventually produced the militarism of the 1930s. Victory planted seeds of future catastrophe. For Russia, the defeat was the beginning of the end of a particular kind of Russia. The 1905 revolution had been suppressed but not resolved. The Tsar had survived but not recovered his authority. The military failures had exposed the regime's incompetence at every level: intelligence, logistics, command, diplomacy. Every lesson the war taught about Russian institutional weakness was ignored rather than absorbed, ensuring that the next great crisis, the First World War, would find the same weaknesses waiting in the same places. Nicholas II drew precisely the wrong conclusions from 1905. Rather than recognizing that modernization of the military, the economy, the political system was essential for survival, he doubled down on autocracy, curtailed the Duma's powers, and surrounded himself with advisors who told him that the old ways were adequate. 12 years later, the same institutional failures that had produced Port Arthur and Tsushima produced the collapse of February 1917. The revolution that Bloody Sunday had threatened arrived in full force when the military disasters of the First World War made the regime's inadequacy impossible to ignore any longer. The broader consequences for the world order were profound and largely unrecognized at the time by those most affected. European imperial powers watched Japan defeat Russia and updated their military assessments without updating their ideological assumptions. They concluded that Japan had won because it had adopted Western methods, Western technology, Western military organization, Western naval doctrine, and that this adoption validated rather than challenged Western supremacy. The right lesson, that Western dominance was a product of specific historical circumstances rather than inherent superiority, was not the one most Europeans drew. Anti-colonial movements across Asia and Africa drew it instead. The generation of nationalist leaders who would eventually dismantle European empires in the mid-20th century came of age in the years after Tsushima. Many of them later described the battle as formative, the moment when the assumption of European invincibility was broken, and the possibility of independence became imaginable. Jawaharlal Nehru, who would lead India to independence, wrote that news of Japanese victories had electrified Asia. Ho Chi Minh, who would eventually expel both French and American forces from Vietnam, cited Japan's example. The battle in the Tsushima Strait echoed for half a century. Japan itself drew the most consequential lesson of all, and drew it incorrectly. The war had been won through careful preparation, intelligent leadership, industrial capacity, and the exploitation of a specific set of Russian weaknesses that wouldn't necessarily repeat. Japanese strategists converted this into a belief that Japanese military will and national spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that the same qualities that had produced Tsushima would produce victory in any future conflict. 40 years later, this belief would lead Japan into a war against the United States that ended with 2 atomic bombs and unconditional surrender. The Russian soldiers who died in Manchuria and the Russian sailors who went down in the Tsushima Strait had not died for anything that proved durable. The empire they served collapsed 12 years after the war. The Tsar they fought for was executed with his family in a basement in Yekaterinburg in 1918. The military failures their deaths revealed were repeated in the larger catastrophe of the First World War. Their sacrifice purchased nothing except the bitter education of a regime too inflexible to learn. Japan had done something genuinely extraordinary. A nation transformed within living memory from feudalism to industrial modernity had defeated the largest country on earth in conventional warfare. The feat required organizational genius, industrial capacity, intelligent leadership, and soldiers of extraordinary courage and discipline. It deserved recognition as one of the most remarkable military achievements of the modern era. What it didn't deserve, what no military victory deserves, was the mythological transformation into proof of national destiny. The war taught Japan that it could win. It didn't teach Japan where winning ended and overreaching began. That lesson would cost enormously more than Tsushima had won. Russia lost the war. Japan won the war. Neither country drew the right conclusions. And the world that emerged from the smoke of Port Arthur and the wreckage of Tsushima moved steadily toward catastrophes that made the Russo-Japanese War look in retrospect like a warning nobody read. Small Japan humiliated mighty Russia. Everyone was surprised. Almost nobody understood what it meant. That gap between surprise and understanding, between witnessing an event and grasping its implications, is where history does its most consequential work. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you like my video and subscribe to my channel. See you soon.